To the second session of the United Nations Trade Forum 2021. My name is Miho Sam, and I'm the moderator of session 2 today. First, allow me to give you some information on the buttons on the screen. At the bottom of the screen, you see a button on the right-hand side, which allows you to select the language. You can select either English, French, or Spanish. You also see the Q&A button at the end, and this allows you to send your questions to the panelists. We first hear the views from the panelists, and then we organize a Q&A session afterwards. So to set the scene for this session, we actually going to discuss what trade can do to achieve more inclusive recovery. When we look at the trade and inclusive recovery, we often face a dichotomy. On the one hand, trade is indispensable for speedy economic recovery, as most countries depend on the import of essential medicines, food, and other goods and services to facilitate recovery. On the other hand, trade has been associated with greater inequality in a society. One UNCTAD study in 2019 found that while reducing income inequality across countries in the past 20 years, trade growth was also associated with a significant increase in within-country income inequality. And this is because much of the gains from trade concentrates on large enterprises. As an example, in Europe, large enterprises account only for 3% of the total number of the enterprises, but they actually account for over 60% of intra and extra EU exports. So what can we do to ensure that everyone in the society benefits from trade? This is the question we would like to discuss with the eminent panelists. And about the selection of speakers, the panelists, yesterday, the acting Secretary General of UNCTAD said that we need to break the silo mentality if we want to make trade contribute to greener and more inclusive recovery. Also, WTO Director General's Madam Okonjo-Iweala said that trade policy should not be confined within the trade community. So we have invited 5 eminent speakers. The majority of them are not trade specialists. Each panelist represents an important socio-economic field, including the public policy, human rights, regional integration, business and finance, and consumer protection. So let me welcome eminent panelists in alphabetic order. First, Professor Mercedes Arauz. She is the Professor of International Economy and Economic Integration at Universidade del Pacífico in Peru. In her political career, Professor Arauz held many important positions in the government of Peru, including being the first woman in the Peruvian history to become Minister of Economy and Finance. And from 2017 to 2018, Professor Arauz was the Prime Minister of Peru. Thank you very much for joining us. Then I'd like to welcome Ms. Ilze Kehris. Ms. Kehris is United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and the head of the UN Human Rights Office in New York. Between 2016 and 2019, Ms. Kehris served as a senior research fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at Lund University, Sweden. Thank you very much for joining us. Next, we'd like to welcome Mr. Nobumitsu Hayashi. Deputy Governor of Japan Bank for International Cooperation. In his role, Mr. Hayashi is leading the bank's effort to support the recovery from the COVID-19 impact in various jurisdictions and industries. Welcome, Mr. Hayashi.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Thank you. Next, I would like to welcome Professor Claudia Lima Marques, who is the Dean and Full Professor of Peruvian International Law at the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. She plays an important role in the world of international law for consumer protection and consumer rights. Welcome, Professor Lima Marques.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last but not least, I would like to welcome Mr. Silva Ojakol, Chief of Staff of the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA, Secretariat. He is a trade economist by training and practice with a strong track record on trade policy and trade negotiations. In his role, Mr. Ojakol oversees the implementation of the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. So once again, thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you, Miho. Thank you very much.
So, without further ado, let me first invite Professor Arrows.
Thank you, Miho. Thank you.
Professor Arrows, you have an extensive experience in public policy with your career spanning high-level positions across the Peruvian government, but also in academics. So here's the question to you. What are the necessary conditions for trade to boost socio-economic empowerment of people in need? And how should the government incorporate such socio-economic concerns into its trade policy? Professor Arauz, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Miho. And I would like to thank you, Mrs. Duran, the Acting Secretary General, and all the UNTAC team for this invitation. I really appreciate that. And also thank you for sharing this table with my colleagues right now. I will share my screen with you. Just a second. Okay, here we go. Well, this is a very interesting question, and I would like to mention that what is important when we're thinking about a more inclusive trade. I would like to show the Peruvian example because it's a working in process, but Peru decided to have a strategy of having trade as an instrument for development, but only as an instrument. It's not the only thing that we did. And as a matter of fact, because of that, we already have a lot of free trade agreements. In the last 15 years, we are connecting with many parts of the world, in the Americas, Asia, Europe, Africa. We're connecting with the world. And we're covering our trade like in 90% of the world with that. You know, our average tariff rate is around 2% at one point. And it's interesting to see that with that openness, we are leading to larger growth, of course. We have also trade policy supports in the country for some key industries: agriculture, mining, fishery, textiles, among others. And we're global leaders in the world in fruit and vegetables, for example, berries, asparagus, quinoa, tangerines. And with this process, in the last 15 years, we were able to reduce poverty from 60% to 20% of the population. Our Gini, which is not so good, we make it possible to have a better Gini index in 42 points, more or less. And we were able to connect with more people. Still, we have a lot of things to do on that. And I would say that the possibilities for us is that we have to keep working. But COVID-19 showed a lot of our problems that weren't solved enough. And that means that we have to focus on some institutional reforms that are important to have more productivity, more equality, and more inclusion. We have to focus in other areas that are connected, and we need to have a strong government connected with the private sector, working together. And that's why I said that we have to have good institutional determinants to make possible to create more, facilitate trade, and at the same time increase productivity and the distribution of the benefits, which are important for us. It's very important that we work together with the business sector, but also not only with the large firms, but we have to work with the small farmers, with the fisheries, and other industries, SMEs, in which we have to connect, have better regulatory efficiencies in order to improve productivity and work in a sense to build these institutions in the service of trade and welfare creation. On the other side, we think that it's very important to focus on technology and on knowledge transfer. Some of the problems of our country are related to that. We are behind many of the North developments in technology support. The digital divide, for example, that we face is very important. We have to focus in a way to make possible that most of our people are connected to the world and can do and use the instruments to improve their capacities, and also at the same time, it's a process, of course, and at the same time, be able to be in the trade industry, but also to be able to improve their livelihoods. One interesting area in which countries like ours can improve is if we work in areas of research and in investigation and development, trade and in development of new ideas, and also using our knowledge. For example, in Peru, we use a lot of knowledge of our biodiversity. Biodiversity is, we can feed the world with our biodiversity. If we really focus on the property, intellectual rights, and also to work in the improvement of seeds based on our biodiversity, I think we can really incorporate many people to better nutrition and also to better spaces of promotion of better goods. On the other side, we have to enhance the value chain. We have to include the small holders, farmers. We have to have capacity building for the workers and the farmers and connect them to the work. For example, one policy that we use is helping cooperatives to work together, small holders, farm holders, landholders, to work in cooperative and to upgrade in a way they can negotiate with the big firms abroad so they can have better prices. Facilitate trade and the logistics for that, and of course have more inclusive labor institutions, the labor market. I put the example of the agricultural promotion that we have. We are not only had economic openness, we really changed the way we work with our institutions like SENASA, which is the service of phytosanitary analysis, the trade promotion from Peru. We have a new law for agricultural promotion, create new important irrigation programs, infrastructure, create a national water authority to support our agriculture, and all the FTAs that were at the end basically part of this process of helping our agricultures to move ahead in trade. So it means a whole national strategy to promote growth. And we have to unblock our many bottlenecks that we have. Informality, for example. It's very important to have people that are in the formal sector into the formal sector. And we can do that with financial inclusion and financial literacy, market access, and support them to have to be part of the value chains. Make sure everybody has social security and healthcare coverage with good health services. And that's a lack we have. We have to improve our regulation and the infrastructure, compliance in trade is very important, the phytosanitary requirements, but also move ahead with, for example, the voluntary standards, sustainable standards. Infrastructure, I mentioned, logistics, reduce transaction costs, reduce the tax distortions and bottlenecks that we have in the bureaucracy. And we should have a social, economic view every time we make our policy. We have to see the gender, cultural, and language barriers, see the spatial inequalities that we have in our territory, the ethnic diversity, which is an advantage for us. That, for me, is a comparative advantage, but also we need to put that in the process of showing that this knowledge that we have with indigenous people can be shown and have the advantage promoted for them. Reduce all these COVID impacts, basically with vaccination for sure, but help particularly the women and youth to have better job opportunities, because they were the first one to lose their employment. And as I mentioned, digital divide, we have to reduce that. As I mentioned, policy design is very important. Poor integration of social analysis to policy design, lack of focus on the territory is something that we have. And we have to focus also in how we are doing, implementing our regulations and policies, and evaluate it every time so we can improve it. I will leave it there so we can see later on what will be the moving forward ideas when we have the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rose, on how we can unblock the equitable trade. I think you have shared this tangible example of 30 years of Peru's path towards global integration, and you have identified key conditions which are to help to prepare the institutional framework that to make sure that equitable distribution of benefit is be done, to promote equitable value chains that would facilitate technological knowledge and also income transfer across all the stakeholders of the value chain. And I think this actually really highlights the importance of not only what social and socioeconomic imperatives to be incorporated, but how we can do it in the government policies. And this really leads to the next question on this important social development policy, which is going to be addressed by Ms. Ilze Kehris, the Assistant Secretary General for the Human Rights within the United Nations system. Assistant Secretary General, the UN Human Rights Office plays a very critical role in advancing this human rights-based approach in businesses and also economic development. So what do you propose to the international trade community to make trade better serve human rights? Assistant Secretary General, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Miho, and I will join the previous speaker in starting out by really expressing my sincere thanks to UNCTAD for this invitation. It's a great honor to be here in this year's annual trade forum to discuss a topic, the green and inclusive recovery, that obviously is very relevant and urgent this day. And certainly with such a prominent panel, I look forward to the discussions as well. The pandemic, of course, we know has revealed the inequalities across societies, with communities and groups that were already the most marginalized and discriminated against were worse hit. So we know that the pandemic is not only a health, an economic, and a social crisis, but as the Secretary General has stressed, it's indeed a human rights crisis. So the dominant development model that we've had in the last few decades has focused on economic growth and wealth creation, but with very little regard to human rights or equitable distribution of trade benefits. So the first thing is that with the recovery, we really have a unique and a historic opportunity to course correct. Human rights-based recovery will not only enhance compliance with human rights obligations, but will bring better and more sustainable solutions for our societies and for the planet. We need a human rights-based approach to trade today. This would mean using the lens of human rights to place people at the center, so trade advances both human well-being and the realization of human rights for all, but of course with a special focus on the most vulnerable in society. The impact of pandemic has led to a heightened focus on economic and social rights, rightly so, but it has also, through its many faceted impacts, demonstrated what we so often say, but not always reflect in our work, namely the indivisibility and interconnectedness of all rights. So affecting also cultural, civic, and political rights, but also increasingly we focus on the right to a healthy environment. So trade can serve to advance human well-being and the realization of human rights for all, with particular benefits to the most vulnerable in society. Human rights, trade, sustainable development, environmental protection are closely interlinked. In the words of the Nobel Prize winner, Joseph Stiglitz, development is about transforming the lives of people, not just transforming economies. So here, the disproportionate effect that we've had from COVID-19 on the most vulnerable and marginalized members of society, both in direct health outcomes and also indirectly regarding livelihoods, is clearly something that we need to focus on fully. The pandemic has laid bare and exacerbated the structural inequalities, both within the countries and between countries. So trade can contribute either to the problem or to the solution. The choice is ours. The most current glaring global gap, as of course you mentioned, was also brought up yesterday and mentioned, is equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. And there were some risk of vaccine nationalism outweighing the solidarity and multilateralism that we call for. So that goes to the heart of issues, cutting across human rights, trade, and development. OHCHR has consistently called for the recognition and access to COVID-19 vaccines as a global public good, accessible and affordable to all. States should cooperate to support initiatives for universal equitable distribution of vaccines between countries, but also promote and adopt effective policies for non-discriminatory access within their borders. That implies sharing health technologies, data and knowledge on vaccines and treatment, flexibility in trade agreements in keeping with the rights to life, to health, development, sharing in the benefits of scientific progress and beyond. That links up to the discussions topical right now on intellectual property, access to vaccines and medicines. Our office in that context supports a positive consideration of a waiver for developing countries, and specifically we support the temporary agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property, like waiver request advocated by over 100 WTO members to combat the pandemic by ramping up production of diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, so that we have equitable and affordable access worldwide. This really is something that is a key issue to address and advance on, and of course set patterns that we also will continue after the pandemic is over. The right to development, a human rights-based approach, should be applied in trade agreements and arrangements. It means taking a hard look at human rights obligations, not only in external action, which some regional organizations and member states do, but also self-scrutiny to ensure alignment with states' overall international human rights obligations. So very quickly, a key recommendation would be in trade negotiations and agreements to adopt the human rights impact assessments that include disaggregated data on potential impacts of measures on poverty, on the right to work, gender equality, minorities, indigenous peoples, youth, and other exposed groups. That also then the outcome of the impact assessment should inform the negotiations or revisions of any trades or agreements. And here I just wanted to refer briefly to the guiding principles on the human rights impact assessment of trade and investment agreements presented by the special rapporteur on the right to food already in 2011, 10 years ago. This is really the issue of states addressing obligations under the human rights treaties, but also to make sure that those are upheld in a consistent and coherent way. We do have the human rights due diligence. This is, of course, to prevent, to mitigate, account for human rights impacts. There are developments, also the issue of effective remedies, and of course there are developments in this regard, very welcome developments, to make human rights due diligence mandatory, and we see this in some developments in some regions. This also corresponds to the UN General Principle on Business and Human Rights. I think I am running out of time, but very quickly I wanted to mention, although we have a speaker also, that in the assessments, our office has, together with the Economic Commission for Africa and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, undertaken the African Continental Free Trade Agreement human rights assessments. And that revealed considerable gaps in addressing gender specifically. So the trade agreement did not include informal trade. And we just heard the previous speaker mentioning the importance of also paying attention to the informal economy. But it carried therefore a significant impact on women's participation in trade, and as the majority of women on the continent engage in informal trade. So that recommendation was that the agreement really pays specific attention to the needs of women and the differential impact of trade on women and trade opportunities. It will evolve. Our office is happy to continue to monitor the process. That was also mentioned, the importance of not having a one-off and not only an ex-ante assessment, but really the monitoring all the time and also the impact as it goes on and course correct as needed. We also, on top of that, we also believe very strongly that the national action plans on business and human rights are a very good tool to advance and make sure that this perspective is consistently included, again, referring to the guiding principles on business and human rights. So here we should all further explore, strengthen the linkage to human rights, especially the right to health, healthy environment, water, sanitation, to green recovery and inclusive sustainable development. The trade and human rights communities have a lot of work to do together. And our office is very proud to be cooperating with UNCTAD on this important agenda, and we certainly look forward to deepening that cooperation and finding better solutions for all as we go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary General, for your concrete proposal how we can bring two communities, human rights community and trade communities, together, because to begin with, they should not be separated in any case. And thank you very much for this idea of, not idea, but your continuing effort of promoting this impact assessment on human rights, impact of trade and investment. And indeed, this, I think we are facing this historic opportunity to really bring in this human rights-based approach to the economic development and recovery strategies. And in this case, for enhancing the access to the vaccines in all over the world, trade policy should facilitate it and should not prevent it in any case. And thank you very much indeed. And you mentioned about this, the activities in Africa. Now I would like to invite a next speaker who will be addressing or sharing information on us on how to bring this regional integration and the socio-economic imperatives together. So in this, I would like to invite Mr. Silva Ojakol of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. Mr. Ojakol, it has been 2 years since the AfCFTA entered into force, and we hear a very encouraging news that the AfCFTA Secretariat is aiming at coming up with a protocol in order to ensure that the women and young people benefit from the implementation of the AfCFTA. So in this context, Mr. Ojakol, what conditions are necessary to help women and youth benefit from intra-Africa trade? And how the international community help the implementation of such important protocol? Mr. Ojakol, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Miho, for the moderation, and would like to thank the organizers for putting together the forum and for inviting the AfCFTA Secretariat to be part of the process. First of all, I would like to say that the AfCFTA Secretariat, yes, came into force on the 30th of May. That is the legal entry into force of the agreement upon the deposit of the 22nd instrument of ratification. But essentially, the operationalization of the agreement started with the inauguration of the Secretary General on the 1st of April last year. And since then, the Secretariat was operating from Addis Ababa for a period of about 4 months. And operations from Accra in August last year. Now, the AfCFTA, the agreement, builds on what is happening at the regional economic communities. This is what it builds on. And there are 8 regional economic communities that are officially recognized by the African Union. And these are, the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, the Arab Maghreb Union, the East African Community, the Economic Community of Central African States, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, the Southern Africa Development Corporation, IGAD, and CEMAC, which is this, taking care of the Maghreb, the Sahel countries. So these are the 8 regional economic communities that are recognized by the African Union. And the AfCFTA, one of the agreement, one of the principles, I think in Article 5, talks about building on the regional, on the REC acquis, the acquis that has been developed in the RECs. Now, when you look at a lot of the RECs, the architecture, and what they have done in the past in terms of building up the trade competitiveness or trade integration in the different RECs, you'll find components of SME development. Now, the SMEs in the African continent are 80% of our enterprises are small and medium enterprises in the continent. And 40% of them, 40% of our cross-border trade is a direct effect of trading by the SMEs across the borders. Now, in a number of RECs, and going forward, if I mention what the RECs did, what we did in the course of the negotiation of the AfCFTA agreement is to recognize that a big portion of our trade is under the control of SMEs. And the SMEs are mostly run by the women and by the youth. And this is the reality across the African continent. You go to any border of any African country and you look at the persons that are engaged in cross-border trade, majority of them are women and the youth that take, small consignments from one country to another, enhancing their capacity to trade, enhancing food security. A lot of what they trade in is food. A lot of what they trade in, are products from small and medium enterprises that are made within the continent. But they also participate in re-export trade. They trade in products that are imported into the continent, but that cross the borders into other countries within the continent. You can call it a mini transshipment, if you like, of a kind. So now in some of the regional economic communities, there have been programs already that we are building on that are enhancing the capacity of women and youth in trading. One of such a program is the simplified trade regime that is operating in COMESA and in the East African community. Now, the simplified trade regime recognizes the effort of the small and medium enterprises to enhance cross-border trade in Africa. And what it does is it has set a maximum amount, a maximum value of a consignment to $2,000 per consignment. Any small cross-border traders with a consignment of $2,000 and below trades across the border without hindrance. And what only is done is the countries under which this is done agree on a list of programs, a list of items that are qualifying. Of course, the rules of origin are adhered to in this kind of trading, because you want to enhance the capacity of African countries to trade in the products that they are producing within their borders. So the rules of origin are adhered to. So the $2,000 consignment below is allowed to trade on a simplified document, one-page document that only shows, and that document is only for the purpose of capturing the data. So we are trying to build on what the simplified trade regime is doing in COMESA and in the East African community, that we can be able to replicate it across the continent. That is one. The second one is that in the Southern African region and in the East African region, there is customs, transit, and trade facilitation initiatives that are taking place, again, at the border area. For example, the one-stop border post, the concept of the one-stop border post for trading across the borders, to ensure that every trader that is trading across the borders is cleared at one side of the border, because all the border control agencies of both countries will be seated at one side of the border, and the same border agencies will also be seated at the other side of the border. So the trader only clears on one side of the border. So when they reach the other side of the border, no need to stop again, unless for any other reason, but not for clearance purpose. So those are simplified procedures now for cross-border trade for persons that are moving, for example, big consignment, truckload, 30 tons, 40 tons, 50 tons, 60 tons cargo across the border. So that is the other aspect that we are looking at in terms of simplifying the trading within the. Then we have an initiative that we are undertaking with the finance institutions, funding mechanisms for SME trading across the border, but also funding mechanisms particularly targeted for women and the youth that are involved in cross-border trade to enhance their capacity, because we understand that some of the challenges that they face are financial challenges, the ability to be able to mobilize the resources that they need to enhance their capacity to buy more consignments, to be able to trade meaningfully across the border. So we are discussing with many of the finance institutions, including the commercial bank. And what is interesting is that a number of the commercial banks now have specific funding mechanisms for women and for youth in cross-border trade. Now, coming to, now before I go to the collaborations that we are looking at for the international community, is that also in the regional economic communities, peace for trade is one of the things that we are focusing on. Peace for trade, because we realize that instability sometimes is generated by lack of alternatives to earning a living. And we're thinking that peace for trade is a critical element to ensure that you have a peaceful environment in which persons are trading. And you give alternatives for, instead of carrying a gun, I should be carrying a consignment of goods across the border. So what are the initiatives that we need? So the Peace for Trading is an initiative that we would like to explore, to put in place, to ensure that the youth are engaged in decent and gainful employment. That then, the lack of which would then lure them into, activities that would lead to violence. Of course, all these things that I have mentioned, we are looking at the Secretariat. At the end of the month of July, we are planning a forum for youth and women in trade. We want a discussion by women and youth in trade that would give us input for the protocol for youth and women in trade that we have been asked directed by the Assembly to put in place. I think that for the organization of the conference, we are working together with the UN Women and with the UN Economic Commission for Africa in order for us to be able to put together a conference during which we shall hear the views of the women and the views of the women and the youth in what they would like to see us put in the protocol, that they will negotiate. They will be part of the persons that will negotiate a protocol that will work for them. Now, what is the collaboration that we'll be looking for from the international community in terms of implementation of the AfCFTA and the protocol for women in trade? Now, some of the things I already mentioned. We need to talk about customs, transit, and trade facilitation to bring an understanding on what are the customs procedures, what are the customs rules and regulations that we should put in place. Of course, we already have a protocol. We have a protocol on trading goods that has an annex on customs, has an annex on trade facilitation, it has an annex on transit. Now, a simplified regime for the women and for the youth is what we will be demanding out of the customs. We're already in discussion with the customs authorities throughout the continent. The second element of collaboration that we'll be seeking from the international community is the harmonization of standards technical regulations. Because if we do not harmonize the standards in the continent, they become legitimate barriers to trade. Because if a product is unable to meet the standards requirements, the SPS and the TBT requirements of the market, of the target market, the SPS requirement and the TBT requirements of the target market becomes a legitimate barrier to trade. But once we harmonize the standards, once we harmonize the product standard, once we harmonize the technical regulations, once we harmonize the conformity assessment procedure, then we shall be opening up a lot of ground for increased trade in the continent. The other one I would like to mention is the monitoring and elimination of non-tariff barriers, which sometimes are in the way of our trading in the continent. I think for the time being, I will leave it at that, and I wait for further questions to come from the participants. Thank you very much, Miho. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ojakol. Indeed, it was so encouraging to hear the actual cases and then the activities that you're already doing to facilitate these small and medium enterprises involved in cross-border trade in small consignments. Majority of them are women and youth with, for example, simplified trade regimes, simplified customs facilitation or clearance just on the one side of the borders, enhancing this financing mechanism for the small and medium enterprises, women and youth. And also very good to hear that the concrete proposals and ideas that how international community can contribute to the AfCFTA's the move and the effort in this area. You talked about, for example, like the harmonizing the standards, regulatory measures, the technical regulations and so on and so forth. I think the first step for harmonization is really to increase the transparency, understanding which countries have which measures. And we are very happy that UNCTAD has been involved and working together with AfCFTA Secretariat in collecting this NTM data across the countries with a view to increasing the transparency in these regulatory frameworks and other NTMs, non-tariff measures, and NTBs, non-tariff barriers. Now, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ojakol. And this is going to be a good floor to move to this focus on business and investment. And at this stage, I'd like to invite Mr. Nobumitsu Hayashi, Deputy Governor of Japan Bank of International Cooperation, or JBIC. Mr. Hayashi, while supporting business sector's investment, I understand that the JBIC is now advocating for the realization of Society 5.0, which is, I understand that the society based on with the human being in the center, or human-centered society using the innovative technologies. So Mr. Hayashi, what is exactly Society 5.0, and does the trading environment matter to the realization of the Society 5.0? Mr. Hayashi, you have the floor.
Thank you very, very much, Miho Sam. It's great to be here with you. As you have introduced us, I'm from JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation. It's a wholly government-owned financial organization that supports Japanese companies' business abroad, trade and investment. We provide loans to Japanese companies, to their overseas affiliates, or to foreign governments or governmental organizations which import them. And we also lend to SPC, special purpose company, that Japanese companies have invested, or we co-invest with the Japanese companies. So I find myself getting more and more less and less trade person than an investment person, but I understand the forum tries to break the barriers. So I'm very happy to join this trade forum. Well, originally, and as yet, we are one of the ECA's export credit agencies, but we do more investment. We sometimes are characterized as one of sovereign wealth funds, and also looking at our outcomes, we're also counted as one of DFI, Development Financial Institutions. Then how do I reconcile these various aspects of our activities with our core mission of supporting Japanese companies? Well, it's not too difficult, because by contributing to a green and inclusive growth, private companies can hope to grow in the long term. And that brings to our finance right returns and right values. Now, how do we achieve an inclusive society? Would you turn to the slide number 2? That is Society 5.0 that Japanese companies, Japan is advocating. We have gone through hunting society, agrarian, industrial, information, and then coming to Society 5.0, which is a human-centered society where cyberspace and physical space are integrated by the advanced technology. Technological innovation isn't just for a limited number of tech giants, but all humanity. Well, if you prefer acronym, it's not for GAFA or BAT, but for SDGs. And such technology can help us to redress inequality in wealth, in education and information, and try to overcome the barriers of energy and food, and let us enable us to leave a green and clean planet to the future generations. So how JBIC is trying to find such innovation. We didn't go to Silicon Valley or Shenzhen, but instead we went to Nordic countries and Baltic countries. We will turn to my page 3, to right. In order to find innovative companies, we set up an investment vehicle, which is nicknamed Nordic Ninja. And we brought along Japanese companies, as shown, Omron, Panasonic, and Honda, which seek to tie up with those startups. Well, in the area of automobiles, every company is competing to get a brand new electric car. But the transformation in auto industry isn't just the electrification, but also the cars will be connected, automated, and shared. We know that Uber taxi has transformed and disrupted the industry. And we found in Estonia, the company called Bolt, which provide passenger service in East Europe and Africa. And it's highly acclaimed because of its price transparency and safety. It offers employment to those women who cannot work full-time, and means of transportation to those female workers who can't afford a car. So by this, JBIC is providing employment in Africa and contributing to women empowerment. Another company we have invested is Logmo from Finland, which has invented the world's first logistic QR code tag. The most important task for the international community is to provide vaccines to every citizen of the world. But even we are successful, there's a bottleneck in the developing countries, which is to transport vaccine in a low temperature environment. The device they have invented can measure temperature, humidity, and shocks, and automatically transit to a cloud platform, which can be read through QR code. They have already contracted to supply such chips in Africa to transport vaccine in a safe and efficient manner. Well, in JBIC, we used to do finance in exporting medical supplies or build a big hospital and operate it. But now we are more and more focusing on such innovation, including AIs, to enhance remote medical care and diagnostic imaging. So these are the kinds of technological innovation which can reduce medical costs and enhances access to medical services to the most vulnerable people. And a good example how technological innovation can lead to Society 5.0. Now, I would also like to touch upon how the trading environments are in the way of achieving Society 5.0. I don't think I need the slide anymore. But let me start by saying what are the unfavorable environments, because every unsuccessful business is unsuccessful in its own way. But there are some examples that I can cite. The usual suspects are the governments are corrupt, but even if they are not, they may import state-of-the-art technology or equipment, but they haven't trained their people enough experience or know-how in operating and maintenance. And then even if they have, they may be lacking infrastructure or supply chain to support the business. So in the G20 meetings Japan hosted last year, the leaders agreed on the principles of high quality infrastructure, which can be also applied to high sustainable trade. That is, that includes to take into account life cycle costs, to develop supply chain, local supply chain and local employment, and to transfer the know-how of operation and maintenance. Well, let me also tell you what we have done in this very hard economic times. It has greatly affected developing countries' economies in general, but very especially the SMEs. And it's also so the case for automobile industry that Japan is proud of. So JBIC has been helping many Japanese companies and Japanese affiliates around the world. Now, India is one of the most severely hit country by coronavirus. Maruti Suzuki, a Japanese company, its sales has been badly hit, but it can stand it on its own and doesn't need our finance. However, those companies who supply parts to Suzuki, those dealers who sell Suzuki cars, or those who provide finance to consumers are badly hit, and they need finance. But unfortunately, we don't know any of them, and nor do we want to understand their balance. So we went a step further in collaborating with an Indian state bank and provided finance to those SMEs that we have never heard of, and try to support their employment. Well, we may be coming out of COVID-19 pandemic in a year or two, but there may be another pandemic, and there may be natural disasters hitting part of this earth. So we will be under continuous such strain. And for the business and the trade to survive, we need sustained infrastructure and resilient supply chain. The role of government is very big, but the players are private. So we continue to support such business through financing, especially SMEs, especially those SMEs, well, including SMEs who are hiring so many women on the ground. I think I will stop here, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hayashi, for this fascinating example of using this digital technology, and which actually makes this sustainable development as one of the key business objectives of many companies. And also, it was very encouraging to hear that it's not only in developed countries such as Nordic countries, but you are also involved with this spreading this kind of beneficial use of the digital technology in African continents and in other countries. Also, thank you very much for this highlighting the importance of building infrastructure. And it's very nice to hear that JBIC is also supporting the subsidiaries of Japanese companies in countries in order to maintain the supply chain resilient to external shocks. Now, with this, I'd like to move to our final speaker and invite Professor Lima Marques, who is the world leading authority on international commercial protection law and policy. Now, as all of us are consumers, we cannot think of any inclusive recovery without improving consumer welfare. We just heard Professor Lima Marques the importance of digital technology for inclusive recovery. So here's the question to you. Do global consumers now experience the new vulnerability in the booming digital trade? And if so, how can we protect global consumers? Professor Lima Marques, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I want to thank Ms. Teresa Moreira and our colleagues from the UNTACT to put together this very important panel. May I have my PowerPoints? Thank you for these questions. Indeed, there are no globalization and also no international tourists without consumer confidence. So please, my first slide. To look to the vulnerabilities, we should look first on what consumers are experiencing in the global digital world today. I want to highlight three of them. First, this digital experience with new forms of economy, especially the question of transparency in this platforms economy, the concentration of traders in new marketplace, small and big, they are together. But in the other hand, we have sophisticated new technologies, and this connectivity is accelerating the time of decision for consumers. We have a multi-screen 24 hours access, and perhaps at the same time, and also the presence of the omni-marketing in all these digital screens, if I may say. So everything is consumption, media, social media, and also in digital day-to-day of the consumers. My second point is the globalization experience. We have on one side the democratization of international digital consumption, perhaps appearance of overconfidence in global trademarks, but in the other side we have or remain a virtual divide between South and North. This delocalization of consumption has also allowed standardization of global chains, and perhaps we can call omni trademarks of global big techs or global providers. The third phenomenon that I want to highlight is this new experience of complexity. Consumers are now facing not only digital or smart contracts, but also new products that good with embedded softwares or service that only work with some products. They have a symbiosis or a synergy between to have the experience for consumers, and also connected or intelligent products. But in the other hand, we have not transparency and the use of artificial intelligence, the big data possibilities, Internet of Things, and really new forms with the fintechs, new forms of digital payments for consumers. And gracious purchases in the internet is the rule, so we have data as payment. And the rise of these new big intermediaries, they are not middlemen, they are gatekeepers, they are really controllers of everything, and also data and algorithms controllers. So the new vulnerabilities, if I may have my next slides, please. I want to highlight three traditional consumer vulnerabilities that now is perhaps deteriorating. The first one is the freedom of choice. We have more choice in the internet, but we have also more tailored information, or what Professor Hayashi called framed autonomy. No control, less freedom. And the omni marketing allowed profiling, influencers, targeting of groups, especially vulnerable groups like children, and internet is a place for children and young. We have this framed access with new discrimination tools that are allowed by big data like geo-blocking or geo-prices. The second vulnerability is the expectation of consumers what quality is, and I call quality and data weakness. The new college today is very difficult to afford. For example, conformity of digital contents, how are fair policies, and how great are the fairness by design in this big techs. The result is that information is quality, and we have information that we need now about new things like use, space, speed, energy, environmental qualities. And indeed, the design is for programmed obsolescence of digital and also with lack of warranties. So the right to repair is disappearing in the digital world. So I wanted to highlight the data weakness, the consent, the purpose, the time frame, and the new frauds that this environmental is allowing. My last point is the redress and access to justice weakness, because the traditional consumer protection, it was about redress, about sanctions. And now the national authorities and enforcement agencies are experiencing difficulties because there are no national solution for our international problem. So we are dealing with new redress barriers for normal consumers, and in cross-border disputes, consumers have less options, and also many of these options are private mechanisms to resolve disputes. So my suggestion is that the time is calling for new global standards, and my suggestion is UN Consumer Global Compact. The next slide, just to highlight here, we are in need for a principle-based solution, like the first UN Global Compact. It was about human rights, about labor and environmental protection, anti-corruption. Now we need some things about enforcement, data protection, and really support consumer rights worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lima Marques, of this, indeed, the vulnerability of the consumers in terms of, somehow digital technology makes us feel freer because we can access to many information. We don't necessarily have to be confined in a geographical location to participate in this kind of meeting, and so on and so forth. But you pinpointed, in fact, that we don't know if we are really, if we have become freer or not, in a sense that everything is more or less controlled by the gatekeepers or controller of big data. And we are the providers of data, but never really have the capacity to make the use of the data. And also as consumers, we don't really have at this moment any authority or public authority to fall back on when we actually face the difficulties. And thank you very much for your proposal on the UN Consumer Global Compact. At the end of this session and in the website of the meeting, I will put your statement on the Global Compact for everyone to have a look at these 10 principles of the UN Consumer, your proposal on the UN Consumer Global Compact. Thank you very much once again. Now, I think we'd like to pick up one question, although the time is very, very short, but from the audience. The question is this: high-income countries are usually the end users of many products from developing countries. For example, the primary commodities such as palm oil, soybean, coffee, and so on and so forth. And there are many sustainability concerns raised in the process in terms of environmental process, social process, and so on and so forth. The question is this: what can high-income importing countries such as the European Union or USA do to address these sustainability concerns in the production stage in developing countries such as Brazil, Peru, Indonesia, and in Africa continents. Probably also in this relation, your answer may, if you feel capacitated to do so, the use of non-tariff measures, basically the regulatory measures, as public trade policies to address these environmental and social concerns in producing countries in the consuming territories, which are basically high-income countries. This was an interesting question. So I would like to ask probably very quickly on your view on these things. I start from the Professor Araoz, if you have some kind of the response to this question. Professor Araoz?
Yeah, thank you, Miho. Yes, for sure. In the FTAs, we have provisions for environmental and labor issues and other social issues. With most of the FTAs we have signed, for example, in the case of Peru. So it helps us to really see these issues of SDGs that are important for us. And I think we have to promote this kind of good relations because that improves our policies. But beware of that too, because it could be also another way to have less market access for South countries. So we have to be very careful on what we want to do. Particularly, I will focus on one issue that the question posed, is the voluntary export, the voluntary sustainable standards, which are private measures that are so heterogeneous and difficult to address and know exactly to do it, who is who in, I mean, we know our supermarkets and many other buyers, but every buyer has a different rule and it's very difficult to address, it's very costly. And at the same time, it's a time consuming, resource consuming for many firms. Only big firms can really do that. Small firms, small farmers usually may be excluded of the process. So we have to be very careful that that won't be an instrument for reducing market access or for making market more concentrated, and also avoiding to have better trade as a whole and improve the abilities of poor countries to really profit from trade. So I will say we have by the way, on Thursday, we have a conversation in the UNFCSS, the UN Forum on Sustainable Standards. It will be next Thursday, talking about this. What we need to do that. I think we have to homogenize these standards and make sure that we also have a clear understanding of what we are doing for each case, because otherwise it will be very dangerous and we can not be part of the global value chain.
Very much, Professor Araoz. Now, may I invite Assistant Secretary General, from human rights perspective, what would be the responsibility of high-income consuming countries to the producing countries in terms of their socioeconomic and environmental challenges that they are facing in producing these products?
Thank you. Yes, I think it really does go back to indeed the trade agreements, both bilateral and multilateral. And we have, of course, increasingly seen the inclusion of human rights clauses in those agreements. But there are two issues to look out for. One of them is that very often those remain declaratory, right? We know that the words don't mean actions. So that really to make those effective, which again goes back to the human rights due diligence, to the impact assessments that need to be made. But on the other hand, of course, exactly the risks that were pointed to now, that of course not to impose the additional cost on the developing country, and that really that it comes to the solidarity in this, that it shouldn't be a finger pointing exercise and something that the more wealthy importing countries, of course, can afford to say, and then the problem is up to you how to do it. But really reaching a cooperative way. The dialogues, of course, often have followed on those that are included also in these kinds of clauses to be able to have to reach it. But also, I think, really coming back to the issue of solidarity, of really how one can, and that brings again into it, of course, confirming the right to development as part of the human rights perspective, but also really including the right to development perspective, and maybe enhancing and working towards really a mandatory or an instrument, including for the right to development, that should be taken on board. And of course, environmental issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary General. Now, I would like to invite also Mr. Ojakol. From your perspective, would you like to respond to this question?
Thank you very much, Miho. If I understand the question, it's on the balance between the environment and what is happening in the trade and development area. Is that the question?
The question was that high-income countries tend to be the consumer of a lot of products produced by developing countries, including the African countries, but probably they have more responsibility in order to reduce the environmental or social challenges that developing countries are facing when they are producing these products, which could be the primary commodities such as palm oil, or possibly other, the metal and the mineral as commodities as such.
Okay, I think I saw it on the post.
Okay, thank you.
First of all, on the environment, I think that the whole world has a role to play. Now, the key question I always want to ask is, who is the biggest environmental degrader? Is it the developing country or the LDCs, or is it the more advanced economies or the developing countries? Who is the biggest environmental degrader? That's for me the key question. The products that are probably produced and those that have been given in that example, the palm oil, the coffee, probably the cacao and other products. If you look at the environment under which some of those products are growing, and I come from a country that grows a lot of coffee, it is usually a forested environment. Now, first of all, those are tree crops. They are tree crops. Coffee is a tree crop. Palm oil is a tree crop. Cacao is a tree crop. Now, in terms of enhancing the environment, in terms of air filtration and so on, I would think that the coffee, the tree crops actually are helping the environment to regenerate. Now, the biggest pollution of the environment, and I'm not an expert here, is actually the industrial production, spewing out lots of soot and stuff into the environment, causing climate change, causing environmental warming. It's not the agricultural activity. The agricultural activity will impact on the environment if that environment is impacting on a water resource. If, for example, we are going to grow paddy rice in a wetland and degrade that wetland and use agrochemicals for that agriculture, and those agrochemicals find their way into the aquifers of the area in which they are grown, that's when you would be talking about environmental protection or environmental damage caused by those crops. So the key question, I think, is really who is the biggest environmental degrader. Now, it is the biggest environmental degrader that should actually have the responsibility to cut down on the degradation activities and enhance the level of the, enhance the level of environmental regeneration in order that we can be able to regenerate the environment. The crops, the products from those crops that have been quoted, as I have said, are tree crops. And those tree crops enhance the environment rather than degrade it. Of course, if we use agrochemicals, if we use, that would certainly degrade the environment. But in many of the African countries, hardly anyone is using, the fertilizer, for example, utilization in Africa is the lowest in the world. Now, to say you curtail coffee consumption, cacao, palm oil, would be to send many of those persons into, again, poverty trap and so on. So I think there has to be a balance between our development aspirations and the rest of the world. But everybody, like I said, we need to begin an assessment of who is the biggest environmental degrader. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ojakol. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Hayashi, what would be your response to the question?
Yeah, it is a very interesting question. There may be several ways to address this question. First, we ECAs or DFIs or UN agency and MDBs all have social and environmental standards. So we keep it, and we don't finance those projects that do not comply to those standards. And the governments of emerging and developing countries may learn how to safeguard their environments. The second thing is that when you can measure a certain damage to the environment, you can have the global regulation or global tax. For example, for the CO2 emission, greenhouse gas emission, we can introduce a universal carbon tax in order to put that into everyone's calculation. Well, now that G7 has agreed on the minimum corporate tax, I'm more and more optimistic about global carbon tax. And third, and most important, is the pressure from the consumers or consumers' choice. Being in a high income consumer, I do feel responsibility. So I do look at my shirt and see how it's and where it's made. There would be more and more pleasure, especially in those high income countries, to find out what they eat, what they are, where do they come from. And here comes the innovation. They should all have a QR code that shows us instantly how is made from forced labor or child labor or whatever. So that will be the kind of society we will be approaching to. Thank you.
Hayashi. Professor Lima Marques, what will be your response?
Thank you very much. I want to highlight the importance of consumer information, but also for collaboration and capacity building in South, and especially in sustainability. I think the role of the civil society is so important that perhaps we should include supporting the universities and also the line of education of the societies. So the pressure will be from the bottom up.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, all the eminent speakers, for your response. Now that I just realized that we only have 7 minutes left, so instead of going to the next questions, although we will be presenting the questions on our website, just for the more wider discussion at the global level, at this stage, I would like to ask each eminent speaker to give the final word as the conclusion of the session 2. And I probably will take the reverse order of the presentation and start with Professor Lima Marques for the final word from you, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the recovery calls for a firm response from ethics, and ethics is about the relation to the other. So I think an ethic of cooperation means that with the current concentration of big traders in digital world, we need the responsible business and big techs to address some of these most pressing issues of the confidence in the global society. And I am suggesting that this global business join a principle-based approach and support consumer rights, promote data protection and data privacy, and encourage consensual and amicable resolution and redress, creating new channels for cross-border disputes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lima Marques. I now invite Mr. Hayashi for your final word to conclude the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. It's been a very interesting discussion, and it gave me the courage and energy to continue to work on SMEs, on the issue of SDGs and in Africa. Last month, we approved a finance to SME called Saraya, which is to produce and sell hygiene products in Africa, including liquid soap or sterilizer. So each of what we do may be very small and may have a small impact, but by continuing to make such efforts, instead of overnight solution, which may create overnight counter action, we will progress toward Society 5.0 with an open and transparent society, with a government that is accountable to people, and men and women who are with compassion. So thank you very much, and let's keep on working. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hayashi. Now, Mr. Ojakol, can we have your final word as the conclusion of this session?
Okay, thank you very much, Miho. First of all, and I didn't start from here, but I'm going to end with it, that the AfCFTA brings together now the African continent for purposes of trade. And I want to say that we are open for trade, we are open for investment. Enhancing the capacity of Africa to trade and to produce is what will enhance the capacity of the world to rejuvenate from the COVID attack. And I think this is critical. And that means then that enhancing the capacity of our SMEs to produce and to trade across the borders becomes a critical element of our strategy from the AfCFTA Secretariat. And we are moving with it. I know we're working with partners, including the UNDP, to enable this to happen. Thank you very much. Over to you, Miho.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ojakol. So now I'd like to invite Assistant Secretary General, Ms. Kehris, for the final word, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the great thoughts that have been put on the table already. I think we really, where we are ending is also where we're starting, and the issue of bridging the gaps, really, overall, and also, of course, the digital gap, which sadly is increasing, not decreasing, was also included here. So there really that focus on integration, especially of vulnerable communities, especially making sure that we also go to the local level and to the small producers, the small enterprises, women entrepreneurs, other small-scale farmers, fishers, and so on, to really make sure that that inclusion perspective, which of course is fundamentally a human rights-based approach, is really fully incorporated and used. And the one thing I would like to stress is really the right to participation in decision-making. This is a right, internationally speaking, of course, a civil political right, but also it's something that leads to better solutions. That's the only way to lead to the solution. So to make sure that that there is effective participation. We know that when it comes to indigenous peoples, we should stress the free, prior, informed consent to any projects or decisions on trade included that concerns them. But civil society, as was stressed again, absolutely including all aspects of civil society and local communities to be able to participate, to be fully informed, and to be able to participate in decisions surrounding trade. Thank you.
Assistant Secretary General. Now, last but not least, Professor Arrows, could we have your final word, please? Thank you.
The speaker?
Thank you. I'm probably with my speaker. Thank you, Miho, and also thank you for all the participants, because we have a very interesting conversation and there's a lot of possibilities for us to work together in creating a better world for our people. COVID-19 has shown us that we have equity concerns that are key determinants of future trade and development, and we have to work on that. Inequalities in the global value chains are in the structures. We have to work to correct the structural problems that we have in this value chains. A global trade-led recovery policy must address these structural barriers, and it's necessary, completely necessary, to have cooperation for global vaccination and coordination of monetary and fiscal policy to development, to correct the problems of development. In terms of that, I think we should have like a trade plus policy, a trade policy design that has social lenses that are focused on development. And we should think that trade and development are global public goods. We need multilateral cooperation, capitalize on the actionable synergies within and outside the UN system, so we can cooperate really to focus on the help of the people. And finally, focus on development finance. If we don't have that, it's very difficult to upgrade the possibilities of people that are in need. Thank you very much.
Very much indeed. Following what you just said, that this really gave us indicated lots of possibility to work together. And listening to you, each representing different field and different constituencies probably, but looking at the same direction, it really encouraged us. It really made us think that, yes, there are many ways to work together, going out of the silo mentality, but try to make a horizontal network. And this is indeed, I think, the essence of our strategy to achieve inclusive recovery. Now, this actually concludes the 2 days of the United Nations Trade Forum 2021. And all the discussions at this session, as well as the discussion at yesterday's sessions at high level and session 1, will provide a very important input to the discussion towards and at UNCTAD 15, which is the quadrennial intergovernmental conference, which will be held in October 2021. At this stage, I think I would like to ask all the speakers to give your best expression, because we're going to make one photograph, group photo together. Is that, yeah? Is anyone who's making the photo? Yes? Okay, so yes. I say 3, 2, 1, 0, okay? 3, 2, 1, 0. I think it is done. So thank you very much indeed, and really your speech and then ideas enriched all our efforts to move towards greener and a more inclusive recovery. Now, in 1 hour time, I think we look forward to welcoming you, audience, to the 17th Prevish lecture by the Nobel laureate economist Esther Duflo, which will start in 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Geneva time. With this, the session is closed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.